Well, as Alessandra said, I'm Tiffany, and I'm going to introduce you to the work that I've been doing in our lab, which combines history bias with working memory. I guess most of you are familiar with working memory tasks that are performed in monkeys or in humans, such as, for example, this classical visual spatial working memory task in monkeys. But currently, there's a lot of effort being put into translating these tasks into rodent models because they allow us to use more advanced techniques in order to understand better what's happening in the brains. And currently, a lot of the key features that were found in other systems have been found in rodents, such as persistent activity or this decrease in delay in accuracy, depending on delay duration. And also a lot of mathematical models are being used to try to understand this. So the aim of my project was to try to develop a working memory tasking model in mice to try to further understand what's happening. So the task that I've been developing is quite simple. I use mice that are head fixed and have two speakers located at both sides of their head. And the stimulus is played coming either from the left or the right or a combination. The animal has to try to measure which speaker was the loudest and remember the source. So after a delayed period of time, animals have to report the decision by indicating the corresponding port, for instance, left in this case. And if they perform correctly, they receive a drop of water. If they don't, they receive nothing, and they share an interchild interval between the two in both cases. So with this very simple task, I wanted to show you a video so you can see more or less what we're working with. Currently, we develop a high throughput setup that allows us to train several animals at the same time, so we can obtain a lot of trials that allows us to measure really specific details in behavior. As you see here, this is a view from below the animal, and you will see in the bottom right corner the epochs of each given moment in time. In this trial, the right stimulus is being loudest, and then there's the delay in between, that in this case is of 3 seconds. After this, the port comes forward and the animal has to report the decision. In this case, because it was a left choice, it was incorrect. So the animal didn't receive any water. We measured this during several days and several animals. And currently, we were able to measure working memory tasks that I referred to up to 12 animals. In this graph that I'm showing here, I'm going to plot the fraction of correct responses against delays. In this example, the delays that were presented were 0, 1, 3, and 10, randomly interleaved. This is one animal example, and you can clearly see from at a glance that there is a decrease in accuracy as delay increases. But it's true that it doesn't go back to chance, which is also quite puzzling. However, this is something found in all the animals that we train, and when we average this, it's a common feature. So this would tell us that in this task, there is a working memory component being involved. However, because in my lab, we're also interested in history bias, we wanted also to address if this was a feature in our task, even though it was never meant to be. For those that maybe are not familiar with decision-making and history biases, animals are not only remembering the stimulus during the delay, but they are also remembering the source of the water. So during the interchild interval, they keep a track of which was the site that get them water. So for instance, if the animal makes 2 consecutive left correct choices, the value of the left, so to say, is increased. So animals feel that side more appealing, and probably they will answer towards that one better than the other one. This preference could be increased and could be decreased also once the animal makes a mistake. For instance, here, the animal made a left response and it was incorrect. So the value of the left side is decreased. This can be the same for right side, and so on and so forth. So this is more or less adding a history bias that can affect current decisions independently of the stimulus. As I said before, I wanted to see if my animals were also affected by these history biases, even though all the trials are always randomized and there's no sequence. So they don't benefit from this. There are other tasks that are involved in that, but in my case, using history bias is not beneficial. It's always a problem. So in here, I average all the probability to repeat in all the trials, and then I split it depending on whether the current trial was following a correct response, a correct trial, or whether if the current trial was following an incorrect response. So in the case of a trial that followed a correct response, we see that the probability to repeat is increased. This is basically following a strategy known as win state, where animals, or in general, all animals tend to repeat the same answer as long as it gives us reward. On the other hand, we have the lose switch strategy that could be found after incorrect trials, where the animals tend to alternate, so they don't repeat that much. They decrease the chances to repeat the previous choice. And this is again a common feature. Animals tend to alternate after an incorrect trial. So with this, I wanted to see if there was an interaction between the delays and the way or the amount of history bias that animals could be using. So I just extended this measurement across different delays. And as you see here, even though the lines are the same height, you don't see any difference with delay. So the differences between them are always equal, or at least apparently equal. This is hinting us that these two mechanisms seem to be apart, at least in some level. So to further quantify this in a more detailed manner, what we did is try to develop a generalized linear model that could account for the amount of importance of relevance that the animals are giving to each of the regressors. So animals are adding up several factors, and that lets them to decide whether to leap left or right, okay? So the first thing that comes into mind is the current stimulus. Animals are doing the task, apparently, and we assume that they are doing the task, so therefore the current stimulus should be important and should be added into their model. The second thing that could be affecting is the delay or the forgetting of the stimulus that is interacting with this. So somehow it's decreasing perhaps the amount of importance that the animal is giving to the stimulus. On a different block, we will have the history bias, the previous correct responses or previous incorrect responses. And this, again, as I said before, is this buffering of rewarded sites that could be also taken into account in order to decide which side to leap to. And again, the animal response is giving an outcome that it's put again into the model. So it's kind of cyclical. So once we fit this generalized model, we would be able to understand the weight that the animal is giving to each of the regressors. So the first thing that we saw is that's a huge relevance for the animals at the current stimulus. So as we saw before, because these values are highly positive, this means animals are using the stimulus. When we look at the forgetting of the current stimulus, we see that this interaction is negative. This is basically meaning that the longer the delay, the less importance the animal is giving to the stimulus. So this is somehow confirming that there is a working memory component in the task. On the other side, we had the previous correct and previous incorrect response that I simplify with win state lose switch for clarity. And we want to first look at the win state. And here you have the importance that the animal gives to the previous correct response. And we see one trial back. And what we will see is that this weight is positive. This means animal wants to repeat, in this case, right. And another key feature is that this is not only found one trial back, but can also be traced back up to several trials back. This is basically meaning that it's not only important what just happened, but also several trials back is important. For the interaction between the win state and delay, we see that there is no weight. So there's no interaction between the delay and the win state. So it doesn't modify the amount of win state that you do. On the other side, when we look at the lose switch, we see the same, just shifting the sign, because in this case it's alternating sides, and perhaps a smoother thing. So maybe they care even more for previous trials. And the same for the interaction with the lose switch and the delay. So these ideas are hinting us at two different, perhaps, models that could explain what we're observing in the behavior. One side, we have the working memory feature that it involves delay, and because we saw that delay is impairing the fraction of correct responses. And at the other side, perhaps we have a more reinforcement learning module, a more innate module that is not depending on delay. To further quantify if these or how these two models are independent, we wanted to look at other features that could affect accuracy. In this graph that I'm showing here, I am plotting the fraction of correct responses against the trial index within a session. These are running average of 20 trials each. So as you see here, there is some fluctuation and a drop by the end of the session. This shape is found in several sessions, several trials, and when you average it, for instance, in this animal, you can see that it's a common thing that there is somehow a plateau, and at some point there is a decrease in accuracy. This difference in the behavior of the animal, even within a session, led us to think that perhaps there are two possible explanations for this. On the one side, we would think, hypothesis A, that what's happening here is that the way that delay affects the stimulus is changing with trialing. So perhaps by the end of the session, they have a harder time remembering, and shorter delays make a bigger impact. On the other hand, we could think that in the end of the session, animals do a completely different strategy, and that's what causes the decrease in accuracy. So to further quantify this, we introduced the trial module into the different regressors that I mentioned before and try to see if this regressor was affecting them in some way in order to make a decision. The first apparent thing is that the interaction between the stimulus and the trial index is negative. This is just basically meaning that as trial index increases, the weight or the relevance that the animal gives to the stimulus is decreasing. So they are not using the stimulus anymore. But however, when we measure how the trial index interacts with the forgetting, we see no difference. So this is basically denying hypothesis A. The way that delay affects the stimulus is always constant. So there should be something else. And this is what we find when we measure the interaction of trial index with win stay and loose sweets. Which in both cases is basically reinforcement of both strategies. So they do more win stay and they do more loose sweets by the end of the session. And the way trial index affect these two modules is separate. So again, this is somehow reinforcing the idea that there are two different modules and that other components such as trial index doesn't affect them equally, and the probability that you would find one or the other can change depending on several factors. This working memory module maybe could work more as a double well, and delay could condition the stability of the memory. And this second module will behave more as a reinforcement learning when there is this buffering of previous responses that eventually lead to a conclusion to either leak left or right, but there is no relevance of the stimulus. And as I said before, animals could transition between these two, and not only that by the end of the session, but also if you paid attention, animals also fluctuate during the session. So perhaps they are also shifting between these two models even though they are engaged in the task. This model could help us predict or try to infer whether the animals are doing one thing or the other. And that could be really helpful in order to understand, for example, neuronal activity, to better quantify whether the animals or the activity that we are observing is because the animal is doing one thing or the other. And that's it. Thank you all for listening. I want to thank the people involved in my project, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Nice talk. At the moment, I don't see any questions popping up. We have still a couple minutes, so I will ask one question to start, kick off the session. I was wondering whether the effect you observe over trials might be due to satiation, so a motivation effect, so that the animals are not motivated to keep the sample anymore, but they just go with the easy solution, which this seems to be more reinforcing. I go repeat the same thing I did before.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's an idea that basically they are just satiated and they go back to a minimum, so to say, the minimum behavior that would lead to a reward. But it's important to note that everything that I show is fraction of correct responses, so they are actually making the effort to answer. There is no invalids, there's no misses, because that could also, maybe they don't do anything, and whatever they do is random. I mean, they take the effort to answer, but it's, I don't know, at least it's fascinating to think that also maybe this behavior is within the session and it's just more obvious by the end of it, and that could also help us clean our data once we try to understand, for example, working memory and try to dissociate one from the other. So yeah, I mean, the reasons why animals do this, one could be dissociation.
Okay, thank you. So there's now one question from Brett also in the forum. In primates, one can also tease out contribution of perseveration versus control of perseveration. Does that play a role?
Perseveration in terms of like animals keep trying, or?
Yeah, repeating the previous response.
Yes, I mean, it's I understand it, or at least I understand it like this, more as if more like a explore strategy. So as long as this gives me reward, I keep doing this, and once I don't find reward there, I change my mind. I try to explore for other source of reward. So it could be perseveration, but it's, I think, more related to this efficient way of behaving of, okay, if I don't find reward here, I shift.
Right, I guess I'm curious if on a correct trial where you don't see a lose shift, can you rule out that the animal got lucky and was perseverating on the previous trial's response?
Yes. I mean, it's hard to dissociate once they do it correctly, if they did it because they were paying attention or because they were lucky. But we are hoping to perhaps when we have neuronal activity to be able to dissociate these two phenomena by being able to see if they are actually doing the task, like try to dissociate. So
Yes.
up to here, we only have behavioral information, but I think also having all this behavioral data so well characterized, it'd be easier to understand what's happening in a neuronal level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tiffany, we have one more question, but I think we should move on to the next question, and we can revisit this question on the end discussion.